What is poppin', YouTube? Back again with another video. Today we're doing my must start, must sit running backs for week 8 fantasy football. Hit that like button and subscribe button if you're new. Going live tonight at 9:30 to answer all your start sit questions. So make sure you tune back into that and let's go. So starting in our S tier, we have CMC versus Cincinnati Bengals. Been averaging 22.8 fantasy points per game. You're starting him. He's in your S tier. Moving on to my A tier, we have Travis Etienne, Tony Pollard, and Austin Eckler. Start off with Travis Etienne going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. 18 fantasy points per game is what our man Travis Etienne has been averaging. Of course, there's been questions around Calvin Ridley. Of course, there's been questions around this overall offense, around Trevor Lawrence, but Travis Etienne continues to get the volume each and every week. And when we're looking at this running back landscape, it kind of gets a little weak at the top, honestly. There's a ton of good quality running backs, but they just aren't performing up to par on a week in and week out basis. So Travis Etienne here is my RB2. We then move to my RB3 for this week, and that's going to be Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard is going up against the Los Angeles Rams. 13.2 fantasy points per game is what Tony Pollard has been averaging. We put Tony Pollard as a buy low running back because really there's been a ton of questions in the comments. There's been a lot of people complaining about Tony Pollard's overall performance because you drafted him in the back end of the first, early second round of your redraft league. And I understand Tony Pollard hasn't lived up to par, but I think this is a get back on track game for my man Tony Pollard. Like Tony Pollard, rest of season, have him super high in my rest of season rankings. So Tony Pollard here is my RB3. And then my RB4 is going to be Austin Eckler. A lot of questions also are coming about Austin Eckler. How is he looking in this offense? Coming back from injury, he's not getting quite the volume. He's getting the receptions, but he's not necessarily getting the goal line work. Josh Kelly's had some few nice runs. Listen, I think Austin Eckler is just getting back up to par, getting back up to health. Shout out to Austin Eckler for all he does for the fantasy football community. But 12.6 fantasy points per game, that ain't winning you the week. That ain't worthy of that first round draft pick that you selected him at. But I have him as the RB4 versus Chicago. The Chicago Bears defense can't seem to stop anybody but the Raiders when they're playing their backup quarterback. So Austin Eckler, I definitely like him this week, and that rounds out my A tier. We then move to my B tier, and in my B tier, we have a ton of running backs. We have Alvin Kamara, Breece Hall, Saquon Barkley, Bijan, Kenneth Walker, Raheem Mostert, DeAndre Swift. Started off with Alvin Kamara, Mr. PPR monster himself, Alvin Kamara. Now, there's a lot to be said about Alvin Kamara, how he's been catching like 12 receptions a game, and especially in PPR format, that's super dominant. Even in half PPR, that's super dominant. 17.3 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging in PPR, going up against the Indianapolis Colts. Now, the Indianapolis Colts, I think the thing about this game that's going to be surprising is the Colts have been putting up points without Anthony Richardson. Gardner Minshew has been getting Josh Downs, Michael Pittman Jr., Jonathan Taylor, all involved. So I think this game is going to be a high-scoring game. And now, high scoring for the Saints. The Saints have been struggling on the struggle bus, but I still think in a game that I think the game script is going to be a little bit more favorable, I still think Alvin Kamara is still going to be the PPR dominant machine. And I think at this point, he's up here in the top 6 to 7 running backs for the rest of the season. I like Alvin Kamara here this week in starting off my B tier. We then move to my next player in my B tier, and that's going to be Breece Hall. Breece Hall is going up against the New York Giants. 12.1 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging. The Giants defense can't seem to stop anyone, and I don't care that Zach Wilson's the quarterback. I think Breece Hall continues to be electric. I think hopefully you had some time to buy low on Breece Hall earlier this season, because right now Breece Hall is pretty much cemented in the top 8 to top 7 running backs each and every week. I like Breece Hall this week as my RB6. We then move to our next player is going to be Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley versus the New York Jets. 15.3 fantasy points per game is what Saquon Barkley has been averaging. Honestly, last week with Tyrod Taylor, the offense looked a lot better than with Daniel Jones. The thing that I like about him over Daniel Jones, especially in the red zone, he is more mobile. So as this offensive line for the Giants has kind of been in flux. Tyrod Taylor, though, he isn't afraid to check the ball down, to give it to Saquon Barkley out in the flat, which I feel like Daniel Jones is like, well, why give it to Saquon for 4 yards when I can get the 4 yards myself? Those are the type of decisions that I enjoy seeing as a Saquon Barkley owner, seeing Tyrod Taylor make. So I definitely like Saquon Barkley here in my B tier. We then move to our next player in Bijan Robinson. Now, is this an overreaction pushing Bijan Robinson this low? Yes. If I felt, honestly, I might have him at the top of the B tier, but I just, based on these other players performing, having good fantasy football days, and Bijan Robinson kind of being on a cold streak, 12.5 fantasy points per game is what Bijan Robinson's been doing. I mean, you're starting Bijan. If you have Bijan, you're starting him this week, but I just could not put him, if you had to be like, who's going to be my RB1, who's going to be my RB2, if maybe you had a few of these guys, I just could not put Bijan Robinson any higher on the pecking order for me. We move to the next player in our B tier, and that's going to be Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker going up against Cleveland, 16.4 fantasy points per game. Kenneth Walker definitely has been fantasy football relevant. He's definitely put us in our place. We were not as high pre-draft on Kenneth Walker, and he's proved us wrong. Shout out to our man Kenneth Walker. But Kenneth Walker is going up against the Cleveland Browns. Cleveland Browns defense has been absolutely destroying teams. San Francisco didn't even look like the San Francisco 49ers offense going up against the Cleveland Browns. So I definitely think it's going to be the struggle bus day for the Seattle Seahawks, but you can't push a guy guy like Kenneth Walker, the talent any lower. I know it's a matchup that we might not be favorable of, but I still have him here in my B tier. We then move to our next running back, and that's going to be Raheem Mostert. Raheem Mostert's going up against the New England Patriots. 19.4 fantasy points per game is what Raheem has been averaging this season. Last week wasn't great against the Eagles. This week it's a little bit better matchup against the Patriots, even though the Patriots defense is pretty good in its own right. It's not the Eagles defense, but it is pretty good. Have him here in our B tier. And then rounding out our B tier, we have DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift is going up against Washington. 13.3 fantasy points per game. We're starting DeAndre Swift. No ifs and doubts about it, but that is my B tier. We then move to our C tier. Our C tier also has a ton of guys. We got Jonathan Taylor, Pacheco, Derrick Henry, Kareem Hunt, James Cook, Josh Jacobs, Joe Mixon, and then Deontay Foreman. When we're starting off with Jonathan Taylor got his get right back on track game last week, scoring 20 fantasy points. We love to see Jonathan Taylor getting back to that because we have Jonathan Taylor as a top 10 running back rest of the season. Probably got a discount on him in the draft and or we're able to buy low in the trade. So we definitely like Jonathan Taylor here, starting off our C tier. Then we move to our next guy in our C tier, and that's going to be Isaiah Pacheco. Isaiah Pacheco is going up against Denver. Great matchup for the Kansas City Chiefs. They're probably going to get up. And let's be clear, they've been in a few different shootouts the last few weeks, but I think this is like an Isaiah Pacheco game where we're talking second half. Isaiah Pacheco is getting the ball. 13.2 fantasy points per game is what Isaiah Pacheco has been averaging. Then we move on to our next guy, who is Derrick Henry, and Derrick Henry's been in the midst of a lot of trade rumors. The Titans seem to be blowing it up. There's no reason for them to be keeping a 30-year-old expensive running back on the roster, even as much as it is Derrick Henry. But I think that Derrick Henry, when something like this happens, he always seems to come out and just prove people wrong. He likes to show that he is still the king. 13.6 fantasy points is what my man Derrick Henry has been averaging this season. It's hard because you can't really move him any lower, but that's kind of where I have him. Then we got Kareem Hunt versus Seattle. And like I said, I think this is going to be one of those days where I know Deshaun Watson isn't starting. I know it's going to be Walker again, but I still like Kareem Hunt. With no Jerome Ford, this is Kareem Hunt's day to shine, and I had to put him up here. I mean, he looked effective when he was out there last week. I think the volume's going to be there. Maybe I should have had him at the back end of this tier, but we're playing it how I feel. I like Kareem Hunt here. Moving on to James Cook. James Cook's going up against Tampa Bay. 11.6 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging. Great matchup for the Buffalo Bills. Great matchup for James Cook. I still think James Cook is a sell high candidate because I think you might be able to get into the Derrick Henry, Isaiah Pacheco, Jonathan Taylor tier with James Cook, maybe in a small piece, but James Cook is here in our C tier. We then move to our next guy in our C tier, and that's going to be Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs going up against Detroit. 11.6 fantasy points per game is what Josh Jacobs has been averaging. Didn't look great last week against the Bears, and the thing is, the Lions are just even better defense. As much as the Baltimore Ravens made the Lions look like not a great defense, I still like Josh Jacobs here in my C tier. We then move to Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon's going up against the San Francisco 49ers. That amazing front. I think it's definitely a good day for T. Higgins. I think it's definitely a good day for Jamar Chase because they're going to have to throw the ball. Joe Mixon still seems to be like a touchdown or bust type of player, but you had to put Joe Mixon here because I don't like a ton of the options behind him. We then moved to Deontay Foreman, and Deontay Foreman had an amazing day versus the Raiders, was the absolute bell cow. Roshan Johnson looks to still be out. Khalil Herbert still looks to be out. So Deontay Foreman, all systems are go, and maybe you could have made the argument that I should have had Deontay Foreman ahead of Joe Mixon, ahead of Josh Jacobs, ahead of James Cook. I just like those guys because they've proven a lot more up into this point in the season, but Deontay Foreman looked good. So if you have Deontay Foreman, you're probably starting him as your RB2, probably starting Deontay Foreman as your flex, but that is how I view my C tier. We then move to my D tier, and we have Alexander Madison, Jahmyr Gibbs, Rachaad White, and Ramondre Stevenson. We'll start with Alexander Madison and the Vikings. 10.2 fantasy points per game is what Alexander Madison has been averaging, going up against the Green Bay Packers. Now, we've had some talks about what are we doing with Cam Akers. Cam Akers looked pretty good in the small amount of run that he had last week. I totally understand he did look good, but we still got to put Alexander Madison out there just purely based on volume. He still has secure hold of that RB1 spot, so I have him here in my D tier. We then move to Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs, shout out to his breakout day. We don't know what's happening with David Montgomery. It's looking like David Montgomery's probably going to miss it this week as well, which shout out to David Montgomery. Get healthy, get those ribs healthy for the fantasy football playoffs. But Jahmyr Gibbs, 11 fantasy points is what he's been averaging this season, but last week, like we said, had his over 20 fantasy point day versus the Baltimore Ravens. A lot of that was in garbage time, but we saw the explosion. So they're going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. This is a great matchup for Jahmyr Gibbs. I would love to start Jahmyr Gibbs if I have him, especially in the flex as an RB2. Have him here in my D tier. We then move to Rachaad White. Rachaad White, another roller coaster type running back. The consistency just hasn't been there for Rachaad White. Going up against the Buffalo Bills. So you might say to me, well, Caleb, why do you have him this high if he's going up against the Bills this week? I just personally think that this is another game where the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to have to be throwing the ball. Rachaad White, PPR monster, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin down the way, check down King himself, Baker Mayfield to Rachaad White, like Rachaad White here. We then move to Ramondre Stevenson going up against Miami. This is another one where you're banking on the Patriots just having to put points on the board to compete with the Miami Dolphins. So we will be putting Ramondre Stevenson here in our D tier. Moving on to my E tier, we then got a few guys. We got Javonte, we got Darrell Henderson, and we got Aaron Jones. And like I said, I know I don't have graphics for some of these players, so apologies on that. But Javonte Williams going up against Kansas City Chiefs, they're going to be down. They're going to have to play. We're just, at this point, it's volume. We like Javonte Williams the most out of any of these running backs in the backfield, especially as he continues to get healthy from that ACL that he tore last season. We then move to our next guy, which is going to be Darrell Henderson. Shout out to all of us that picked up Darrell Henderson. Didn't have to compete with everyone going after Zach Evans. That was kind of insane last week. But Darrell Henderson, 13.1 fantasy points is what he put up last week. I think this is another good day for Darrell Henderson going up against Dallas. He's probably touchdown or bust, like almost like a mini light Joe Mixon type of player. But if you have to throw him in your RB2, you got to throw him in your flex, especially with all the buys. I totally understand that. We move to our next player, which is going to be Aaron Jones. Mr. Aaron Jones himself feels like he should be higher. 11.6 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging. Going up against Minnesota, it's the roller coaster too with Aaron Jones, with his injuries, with his performance. How many touches is he going to be getting this week? All sorts of things to be monitoring for Aaron Jones. Maybe Aaron Jones should be higher. But I have a feeling that if you have Aaron Jones, he's still probably making his way into your flex spot. And then we move to our F tier. And this is where we got Gussie Boy Edwards, Brian Robinson, Najee Harris, and Jalen Warren. When we look at Gus Edwards is going up against Arizona. 8.6 fantasy points is what he's been averaging. Can he get a touchdown? I mean, Lamar Jackson, they looked absolutely elite last week. If that offense continues to hum the way it should, I could definitely see Gus Edwards definitely rising up the board in the coming weeks. We then go to Brian Robinson. Brian Robinson's been having quite the fantasy football season himself. We were really not expecting Brian Robinson to kind of be this good. 12.5 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging. But this week he's going up against the Philadelphia Eagles defense. So you could definitely make the case, maybe I should be putting Najee Harris, maybe I should be putting Jalen Warren ahead of Brian Robinson. But man, the results speak for themselves. If he can somehow sneak a touchdown in there, I definitely think Brian Robinson is good. We then move to Najee Harris, Jalen Warren. Najee Harris finally had his great day, 15 fantasy points this last week. Jalen Warren, 8.2. Both are looking pretty explosive. So we definitely like to see that for both of them. But I think if you have Najee, you got to try to sell high. But if not, I mean, RB3, high-end RB2 type capabilities for Najee Harris rest of season. So Najee Harris here in our F tier. And then moving to our final guy in our F tier, and it's going to be Zach Moss. I know what you're saying, Caleb, you'd like Jonathan Taylor. I think last week we were a little conservative on Jonathan Taylor, but Zach Moss is still putting up decent fantasy points. I think he's still worthy of a consideration on a flex play because they continue to split the touches between Jonathan Taylor and Zach Moss. Now, as the season continues, I fully expect it to go to being like a 65-35, 60-40 split between Jonathan Taylor and Zach Moss, especially with the fact that they're going to have to be running the ball a lot more just because Anthony Richardson is not the starting quarterback with Gardner Minshew in there. Gardner Minshew's look good, but he does like to make those mistakes. So they tend to be a little bit more conservative with Gardner Minshew in there. For me, Zach Moss, another viable flex candidate here in our F tier. So appreciate you guys so much for tuning in. Here is the full tier list. Like I said, ask me any start sit question down below. I will answer that for you. We'll be going live tonight at 9:30. So make sure you tune into that live stream answering all start questions there as well. I want you to come hang out with me, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.